The laughter started before Marianne Ellery even reached the top of the staircase. She heard it rolling through the ballroom like a wave, sharp and cruel, and she knew without looking that it was aimed at her. She paused on the landing, one gloved hand resting on the cool marble rail, and forced her spine to stay straight. 11 years of practice had taught her how to walk into a room full of people who despised her, without letting a single one of them see her flinch. Below her, the candlelight caught the edge of her high collar, the fabric stitched carefully to hide the scars that ran from her jaw down the side of her neck. She had worn collars like this since she was 12 years old, since the night her family's house had burned to the ground and taken her parents with it. The fire had taken more than that. It had taken her place in the world. "There she is," a voice said, carrying easily across the marble floor. Lady Cordelia Vane did not bother to lower her voice when she spoke of Marianne. She never had. The little burned mouse creeps out of her hole again. A ripple of laughter followed, thin and eager, from the cluster of young women gathered near the punch table. Miss Selina Pratt laughed loudest of all, her eyes bright with the particular joy of a girl who had found a target that would never fight back. Marianne descended the last few steps with her chin level, and her eyes fixed on a point across the room. She had learned that if she looked at nothing, she could not see the pity or the disgust on the faces around her. She had learned to walk through humiliation the way one walks through rain, simply enduring it, waiting for it to stop. "Do you suppose she wears those collars because she thinks it fools anyone?" Cordelia said to Selina, not troubling to whisper. "Everyone knows what is underneath. My maid says the scars go all the way down her arm as well, like melted wax." "Perhaps that is why no man will have her," Selina said. "Who would want a wife who looks like that beneath her sleeves?" Marianne kept walking. Her aunt, Mrs. Ophelia Ellery, stood near the far wall in conversation with another matron, and though she must have heard the words carried across the room, she did not turn. She never turned. Mrs. Ellery had taken her niece in out of duty after the fire, and duty was as far as her affection had ever stretched. Marianne had long since stopped expecting anything more. She found a quiet corner near a tall window and stood there, watching the dancers turn beneath the chandeliers, feeling the old ache settle into her chest. It was not new. It was familiar, worn smooth by repetition, like a stone rubbed soft by a river. She had told herself years ago that she would survive these evenings by simply outlasting them, by counting the hours until she could return home and remove the collar and breathe. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the entire room seemed to shift. A hush moved through the crowd the way wind moves through wheat, one voice falling silent after another, until the orchestra itself seemed to soften. Marianne looked up along with everyone else, curious despite herself, and saw a tall man standing in the doorway, dressed in dark evening clothes that fit him with quiet, unshowy perfection. "The Duke of Thornbury," someone near her whispered, and the name moved through the room like a spark catching dry grass. "He has been abroad for years. I did not know he had returned to town." Marianne watched him step into the ballroom with the easy authority of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair and a face that held itself very still, as though he had trained himself long ago not to show what he was thinking. Every unmarried woman in the room straightened at once, and Cordelia Vane's laughter died in her throat as she turned to look at him with open calculation. The Duke did not look at Cordelia. He did not look at Selina, or at the cluster of eager mothers already angling their daughters toward him. His gaze swept the room once, briefly, the way a man might check a familiar landscape for something out of place. Then his eyes stopped on Marianne. She felt it before she understood it, a strange prickling awareness that ran down her spine. He was looking at her the way no one had looked at her in 11 years, not with pity, not with disgust, but with something else entirely, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he already knew her, as if he had been searching for her without knowing it. She dropped her gaze first, certain she had misread it, certain that a duke fresh from years abroad would have no reason on earth to look at the scarred niece of a minor gentry family with anything but polite indifference. When she lifted her eyes again a moment later, he was still watching her, and this time something in his expression had settled into quiet certainty, as though he had confirmed something he had long suspected. "Ashcombe," said a voice at his shoulder, warm and familiar. Marianne recognized Colonel Anthony Reeve, a friend of several respectable families in the district, falling into step beside the Duke as he moved further into the room. "You disappear for 3 years, and return without a single word of warning. Half the mothers in this room are already planning weddings." "Let them plan," the Duke said, his voice low and even. "I have not come tonight for weddings." "Then why have you come?" The Duke did not answer at once. His gaze drifted back across the ballroom, searching, and found Marianne again, where she stood near the window. Something flickered behind his composed expression, something that looked almost like old grief mixed with disbelief. "I heard a name mentioned in passing this afternoon," he said quietly, so quietly that only the colonel beside him could hear. "A name I did not think I would hear again in this life." Cordelia Vane, never one to remain unnoticed for long, glided toward him with a bright smile already fixed in place. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a graceful curtsy. "How wonderful that you have returned to us. London has been quite dull without a Thornbury to enliven it." "Lady Cordelia," the Duke said, with the correct amount of courtesy and not a hint more. His eyes moved past her almost immediately, returning to the window where Marianne stood, and Cordelia's smile faltered as she noticed where his attention had gone. "Surely you are not looking at the Ellery girl," Cordelia said, laughing lightly, as though sharing a private joke. "Poor thing. A tragic accident left her rather disfigured as a child. We are all very kind to her, of course, but I would not trouble yourself with an introduction. She hardly ever speaks in company." "I did not ask for your opinion of her," the Duke said, and though his tone remained perfectly civil, something in it made Cordelia's smile disappear entirely. He crossed the ballroom floor without another word, leaving Cordelia standing alone, with her mouth slightly open, leaving Selina staring after him in open astonishment, leaving a trail of whispers rising in his wake like startled birds. Marianne watched him approach with a rising sense of unreality, certain there had been some mistake, certain he would stop before he reached her and turn toward someone else, someone whose face and neck were not marked by old fire. He did not stop. He came to a halt before her and bowed, a proper, formal bow, the kind given to a lady of consequence, not to a poor relation mocked by half the room only minutes before. "Miss Ellery," he said, "I do not believe we have been introduced. I am Weston Ashcombe." Marianne's throat tightened. She managed a small curtsy, her mind scrambling for the correct words, aware of dozens of eyes fixed on the two of them, aware of the sudden ringing silence that had fallen across the nearest circle of guests. "Your Grace," she said, "I am honored." "The honor is mine," he said, and there was something in his voice, some careful gentleness, that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. "Would you do me the courtesy of a dance?" For a moment, she could not speak at all. No man had asked her to dance at a public gathering in longer than she could remember. She had grown accustomed to standing at the edges of rooms, to being spoken of rather than spoken to being an object of amusement rather than a person anyone wished to know. She searched his face for mockery, for the cruel jest she was certain must be hidden somewhere in this request, and found none. His dark eyes held only quiet steadiness, and something else beneath it that she could not name. "I do not dance often, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I would not wish to embarrass you." "You could not embarrass me," he said. "I would count it a far greater embarrassment to leave this ballroom without having danced with you." Behind her, she was aware of Cordelia and Selina watching with open, furious astonishment, aware of her aunt turning at last to see what had drawn the attention of the entire room, aware of 100 small conversations pausing mid-sentence. She had spent 11 years learning how to disappear inside crowded rooms, and now, impossibly, she was the center of one. She placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that startled her, as though he were holding something precious, something he had been afraid he might never hold again. He led her onto the floor as the orchestra began a new piece, and the other dancers parted to make space for them with a kind of stunned, instinctive courtesy. "You are trembling," he said quietly, as they began to move through the steps. "Forgive me. I am not accustomed to this." "There is nothing to forgive." His hand rested lightly at her waist, correct and proper in every particular, and yet she felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her gown, like a small, steady fire. "Miss Ellery, may I ask you something that may seem strange?" "Of course. Did you grow up near Ashford Lane, in the county of Hallowmere? As a child, I mean, many years ago." The question struck her like cold water. She had not heard the name of that place spoken aloud in over a decade. It was the address of the house that no longer existed, the house that had burned in a single terrible night when she was 12 years old, taking her parents and nearly taking her as well. "I did," she said slowly. "How could you possibly know that?" Something passed over his face, an emotion so complicated she could not read it fully. Part relief, part sorrow, part something that looked almost like wonder. "I wondered," he said softly, "if you might remember a boy who once carried a burning beam off your leg and pulled you out through smoke thick enough to blind a man, and left you on the grass outside, before running back in to search for anyone else still trapped inside." Marianne's steps faltered. The music continued around them. The candlelight continued to glow. But for a moment, the whole ballroom seemed to fall away, replaced by the memory she had carried for 11 years, without ever having a face to attach to it. She remembered heat and smoke and terror, and a pair of strong arms lifting her, and a voice telling her to hold on, to just hold on, and then nothing, because she had lost consciousness before she ever saw the face of the person who saved her. "That was you," she whispered. "That was me," he said. "I was 17. I had been riding home along the lane when I saw the smoke. I have thought of that night more times than I can count, wondering what became of the girl I pulled from the fire. I never learned your name. By the time I returned with help, you had already been taken away, and no one I asked seemed to know where." Tears rose in her eyes before she could stop them. "I did not know," she said. "I never knew who saved me. I have wondered for 11 years. Now you know," he said, and his hand tightened very slightly around hers, as though he meant to make certain she understood he did not intend to let her disappear from his life a second time. Across the ballroom, Cordelia Vane watched the Duke of Thornbury dance with the girl she had spent years humiliating, watched the way his gaze never left her scarred face, watched the astonishment ripple through the crowd like fire through dry grass, and felt something cold and furious settle in her chest. Whatever was happening between the Duke and Marianne Ellery, she decided in that moment, she would not allow it to continue unchallenged. The music ended. The Duke bowed over Marianne's hand, and for the first time in 11 years she walked away from a ballroom not with her head bowed in practiced endurance, but with her heart pounding for an entirely different reason, and the eyes of the entire room following her, no longer with mockery, but with a question none of them yet knew how to ask. The night was far from over, and neither, though she did not yet know it, was the story that had begun the moment the Duke of Thornbury walked through those doors. Word had already begun to travel by the time Marianne reached the edge of the ballroom again, slipping free of the crowd to catch her breath near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. She pressed her gloved hand to her collarbone, feeling her own pulse beating fast beneath the fabric, and tried to steady the storm of feeling that had risen inside her during those few short minutes on the dance floor. For 11 years she had told herself a simple story about her own life. She was the burned girl, the poor relation, the cautionary tale mothers used to warn their daughters against carelessness with candles and hearths. She had built her entire existence around the expectation of being overlooked, of being pitied at best and mocked at worst, and she had made her peace with it, because the alternative, hoping for anything more, had always seemed like a cruelty she could not survive twice. Now a Duke had looked at her as though she were the only person in the room worth seeing, and she did not know what to do with the wreckage that hope had made of her careful defenses. "Miss Ellery." She turned to find Colonel Reeve approaching, his expression kind and faintly amused. "Forgive me for startling you. I only wish to say that I have known Ashcombe since we were boys together, and I have never in my life seen him cross a ballroom the way he crossed this one tonight." "I do not know what to make of it," Marianne admitted. "Nor, I think, does he entirely," the colonel said. "But I have rarely seen a man look so certain of anything as he looks certain of you." He inclined his head politely and moved off toward the card room, leaving Marianne alone with her racing thoughts once more. She did not have long to sit with them. Her aunt appeared at her elbow within minutes, her face a mixture of confusion and calculation that Marianne recognized well. Mrs. Ellery had never shown much interest in her niece beyond the minimum required by duty, but a duke's attention was not the sort of thing even the most indifferent guardian could ignore. "What did he say to you?" her aunt asked without preamble. "The Duke, what did he want?" "He wished to dance," Marianne said simply, unwilling to share the rest, the memory of fire and rescue that felt too fragile and too precious to hand over to a woman who had never once asked her how she survived that night. "He is the wealthiest unmarried man in 3 counties, her aunt said, half to herself. "If he has taken some manner of fancy to you, we must not do anything foolish to discourage it." Marianne said nothing. She had learned long ago that her aunt's sudden interest was rarely about her happiness, and she felt no inclination to explain a connection she did not yet understand herself. Across the room, Cordelia Vane pulled Selina Pratt into a quiet alcove behind a bank of hothouse flowers, her face tight with barely restrained fury. "Did you see it?" she hissed. "Did you see the way he looked at her, as though she were something precious, and not a scarred nobody who should be grateful anyone looks at her at all?" "Perhaps it is only a passing fancy," Selina offered, though she did not sound convinced. "It had better be," Cordelia said. "I have spent 3 seasons positioning myself to be exactly the sort of wife a man like Thornbury would want." I will not lose him to a girl no respectable family would have chosen, if not for pity and the accident of her birth. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the Duke make his way back across the ballroom, his gaze already searching the crowd, unmistakably searching for one particular face. Whatever this is, I intend to end it before it becomes anything more. The Duke found Marianne again near the windows, his expression softer now than it had been at the start of the evening, as though the formal mask he wore in public had cracked just slightly in her presence. I hope I did not overwhelm you, he said quietly. I have imagined this meeting for a very long time, and I fear I managed it rather clumsily. You did not overwhelm me, Marianne said, though it was not entirely true. You gave me an answer to a question I had carried for 11 years. That is not clumsiness. That is a kindness I never expected to receive. I would like, if you permit it, to call upon you properly. Not tonight, in the middle of a crowded ballroom with half of London watching, but in a manner that gives you room to decide whether you wish to know me further, without the pressure of an audience. His dark eyes held hers steadily. I will understand if the answer is no. I know what a night like tonight can do to a person unused to attention, and I do not wish to become simply another burden you must carry. Something in his phrasing, the careful acknowledgement of what her life had been, the plain refusal to pretend the years of cruelty had not happened, moved her more than any flattery could have. I would welcome a call, Your Grace, she said. Weston, he said. If we are to know one another properly, I would prefer you use my name. Weston, she repeated softly, and something in his face eased, as though hearing it from her had settled some old ache he had carried since he was a boy of 17 searching for a girl he had pulled from the fire and never found again. He took his leave shortly after, aware that his continued presence beside her would only draw more attention than either of them could easily manage in a single evening. Marianne watched him go, watched the way the crowd parted for him and closed again in his wake, and felt, for the first time since she was 12 years old, something that might have been the beginning of hope. She did not see the look Cordelia Vane gave her from across the room, sharp and cold as a blade, or hear the whispered plans already forming between Cordelia and Selina as they retreated further into the shadows of the alcove. She did not yet know that the ease of this single evening, the wonder of being seen and chosen after so many years of being overlooked, would come at a cost that Cordelia intended to make her pay in full. For now, Marianne allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She allowed herself to hope that the boy who had once carried her out of a burning house had returned, 11 years later, to carry her out of something else entirely. The long, quiet fire of loneliness she had lived inside for more than a decade, one that had never once shown any sign of going out on its own. The carriage that carried her home that night rattled over the cobblestones, and Marianne sat with her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the dark city slide past, turning over every word Weston Ashcombe had spoken to her. She did not yet know how much would change in the weeks that followed, how many old wounds would be reopened before they could finally be allowed to heal, or how far Cordelia Vane was prepared to go to make certain that the girl she had mocked for years never rose above the place she believed Marianne belonged. She knew only that for the first time in 11 years she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who did not flinch from her scars, and that the memory of his hand closing gently around hers was enough, for tonight, to hold back the darkness that had followed her for so long. True to his word, Weston called at the Ellery house 3 days later, arriving with a small bouquet of white roses and a request so simple it startled Marianne all over again, merely to walk with her in the garden if the weather permitted. Her aunt hovered near the doorway for the first quarter hour, unwilling to leave a Duke unattended with her niece, until the promise of tea in the drawing room finally lured her away and left the two of them alone among the rose bushes. I confess I did not sleep well after the assembly, Weston said, as they walked slowly along the gravel path. I kept thinking of all the years I searched for you without success. I hired men to make inquiries in Hallowmere more than once. I was told the family who survived the fire had moved away, and no one seemed to know where. My aunt took me in within the month, Marianne said. We left the county almost immediately. I think she wished to spare me further reminders of what happened, though I have often wondered if she also wished to spare herself the burden of neighbors who knew the whole sad story. Was she unkind to you? Marianne considered the question carefully, unused to anyone asking it so directly. Not unkind, precisely, simply distant. I do not think she ever knew what to do with a niece who arrived scarred and grieving, and entirely dependent on her charity. She provided for me because it was expected of her. She never once asked how I felt about anything. That must have been very lonely. It was, she admitted, surprised by how easily the truth came when he asked for it. I learned quickly that the less I said, the less trouble I caused, and the less attention I drew to myself, the fewer opportunities anyone had to remind me of what I had lost, both my parents and, in the eyes of society, any hope of a normal life. Weston stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression grave. You have not lost that hope, Marianne. I do not say that lightly. I have watched you endure things this past week that would have broken lesser people, and I have seen nothing in you but quiet strength. Whatever hope you believe you lost in that fire, I intend to help you find it again, if you will allow me the honor of trying. She did not know how to answer him, so instead she simply let him continue walking beside her, and for the rest of that afternoon, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps he meant every word. Over the following fortnight, Weston called upon her with a regularity that quickly became the talk of every drawing room in the district. He accompanied her and her aunt to church, sat beside her at a small dinner hosted by Colonel Reeve and his wife, and on one memorable afternoon, simply appeared at the house with a set of watercolors and suggested they paint the garden together, an activity at which he proved, to Marianne's great amusement, thoroughly hopeless. You have painted the rose bush the color of a bruise, she told him, laughing for what felt like the first time in years. I have always excelled at business and rather less at art, he said, unbothered, watching her laugh with an expression of such open contentment that she felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. I find I do not mind looking foolish, provided it makes you smile. It was during these quiet, ordinary hours, walks in gardens, shared cups of tea, small unremarkable conversations about books and horses and the weather, that Marianne felt something inside her that had been frozen for 11 years, slowly begin to thaw. She had spent so long believing herself unworthy of ordinary happiness, that the experience of simply being liked, being sought out, being spoken to as though her opinions mattered, felt almost dizzying in its novelty. But not everyone in society shared her joy. Cordelia Vane had spent the fortnight watching the Duke's growing attachment with mounting fury. Her every attempt to draw his attention back to herself met with the same polite, immovable indifference he had shown her at the assembly. She began to speak of Marianne differently now, no longer with open mockery, which had become socially risky given the Duke's evident regard, but with something more insidious, a slow campaign of doubt disguised as concern. I only worry for him, she confided to a circle of acquaintances at a card party, her voice carrying just far enough to be overheard by those she intended to influence. A man of his fortune and standing is always a target for those with less to offer. I do not say Miss Ellery means any harm, but one cannot help noticing how quickly her aunt's fortunes might improve, should such a match come to pass. The rumor spread the way rumors always spread among the idle and the bored, gathering detail and certainty with each retelling. By the end of the week, it was being whispered in half the drawing rooms in the district that Marianne Ellery, desperate and calculating, had set her cap at the Duke of Thornbury the moment she learned of his fortune, using the sentimental tale of a childhood rescue to secure his sympathy and, eventually, his hand. Marianne heard the first whispers of it from her aunt, who repeated them with an odd mixture of alarm and self-interest. They are saying you schemed for this, Mrs. Ellery said, wringing her hands in the drawing room one evening, that you invented some manner of connection to the fire simply to win his attention. You must be careful, Marianne. If people believe you a fortune hunter, it could ruin whatever chance you have. I did not invent anything, Marianne said, stung by the accusation even second-hand. He remembered me before I remembered him. I said nothing at the assembly beyond the truth. I know that, but truth matters little once a rumor has taken hold. You must think of how this appears. The words settled into Marianne's chest like a stone, reviving old fears she had thought Weston's kindness might finally have quieted. She had spent 11 years believing herself unworthy of good fortune, and here, at last, was the proof she had always secretly expected, that any happiness offered to her would be questioned, doubted, twisted into something shameful by people who could not bear to see her rise. When Weston called the following afternoon, he found her subdued in a way that concerned him immediately. What has happened? He asked, taking a seat across from her in the drawing room, his sharp eyes missing nothing of her pale face and tightly folded hands. Nothing of consequence, she said, though her voice betrayed her. Marianne. His tone was gentle but firm, the tone of a man unwilling to accept a polite deflection. Please tell me. She told him, haltingly at first and then in a rush, of the whispers spreading through the district, of the accusation that she had schemed to win his affection, that her aunt's sudden interest in the match only lent credibility to the claim. I would understand, she said quietly, staring at her hands. If such talk made you reconsider your attentions toward me, I would not wish to be the cause of scandal touching your name. Do you believe I care one particle for what Lady Cordelia Vane whispers behind her fan? He asked, his voice sharpening for the first time since she had known him. I believe you should, Marianne said. You are a duke. Your reputation matters, and mine has never been anything but a liability to those unfortunate enough to be associated with me. That is not true, and I will not hear you speak of yourself that way. He rose and crossed to sit beside her, taking her hands in his despite the impropriety of it, his grip firm and certain. I did not seek you out because of a rumor or a scheme. I sought you out because I spent 11 years wondering what became of a girl I once pulled from a burning house, and when I found her, I discovered a woman of such quiet courage and grace that I could not imagine walking away from her again. Nothing Cordelia Vane says will change that. But if the talk continues, if it grows worse, then let it grow worse, he said. I have weathered worse things than gossip. What I could not weather is losing you a second time, simply because I was too cautious to defend what I know to be true. Marianne wanted desperately to believe him, and in the warmth of his presence, sitting close enough to feel the steady conviction radiating from him, she nearly did. But that night, alone in her room, the old fears crept back in, whispering that his devotion, however sincere, could not withstand the full weight of society's judgment forever, that eventually the cost of loving her would prove too high, even for a man as determined as Weston Ashcombe. She began, in small and painful ways, to pull back. She found reasons to shorten their walks, excuses to decline invitations that would place them together in public, gentle deflections whenever he tried to speak of the future. She told herself she was protecting him, sparing him the scandal that clung to her like smoke long after any fire had gone out. But in truth, she was protecting herself from the devastation of hoping for something she still could not quite believe she deserved. Weston noticed, of course. He noticed everything about her, the small shifts in her manner, the new distance in her eyes, the careful, polite formality that had begun creeping back into her conversation like a wall rebuilding itself brick by brick. And he resolved, quietly and with the same steady determination that had once sent a 17-year-old boy running into a burning house without a moment's hesitation, that he would not allow 11 years of loneliness to steal her away from him now, not when he had only just found her again. Meanwhile, in a drawing room across town, Cordelia Vane sat with Selina Pratt, refining a plan far more dangerous than mere whispers, one that would not simply cast doubt on Marianne's character, but would strike directly at the one wound she had spent her entire life trying desperately to hide from the world. Weston arrived at the Ellery house the following morning without sending word ahead, a breach of etiquette so unlike him that Mrs. Ellery nearly dropped the teapot when the housemaid announced him. He found Marianne in the small back parlor, seated near the window with a piece of needlework abandoned in her lap, and he did not wait for the usual pleasantries before speaking. I have come to ask you something, and I would ask that you answer honestly, even if the honest answer is not what I wish to hear. Marianne set aside her needlework, startled by the intensity in his voice. Of course. Are you retreating from me because you no longer wish for my company, or because you believe my company will cost me something you think I cannot afford to lose? The directness of the question stole the breath from her chest. She opened her mouth to offer some polite evasion, some careful half-truth of the kind she had perfected over 11 years of protecting herself from disappointment, and found she could not do it. Not to him, not when he stood before her with such plain, unguarded honesty in his eyes. The second, she admitted quietly. I fear what continued attention from you will cost you, Weston. I fear it more than I can properly explain. Then let me explain something to you instead. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, an act so far beneath his rank and station that she stared at him in astonishment. When I was 17 years old, I rode past a burning house and heard a child screaming inside. I did not think of what it might cost me to run into that fire. I did not weigh my own safety against the value of a stranger's life. I simply went, because some things matter more than the price we might pay for them. That was a fire, Marianne said softly. This is different. Is it? You are the same fire to me now, Marianne, in every way that matters. I did not spend 11 years wondering what became of you, only to abandon you the moment loving you required something of me. Let people whisper. Let Cordelia Vane spread whatever poison she likes. I am not 17 anymore, uncertain and untested. I am a man who has built a life, who commands respect in every circle that matters, and I intend to use every ounce of that respect to make certain the world sees you as I see you, not as a scarred curiosity to be pitied or mocked, but as a woman of extraordinary courage, worthy of every good thing life has to offer. Tears rose in her eyes, unbidden and impossible to stop. I do not know how to believe that, she whispered. I have spent so long believing the opposite. Then let me spend however long it takes convincing you otherwise." He reached up and gently touched the edge of her collar, not to pull it away, but simply to rest his fingers there, over the place where the scars began. "I am not asking you to hide this from me, Marianne. I am not asking you to hide it from anyone, ever again. I want to stand beside you exactly as you are, in front of everyone who ever made you feel you needed to hide." She could not speak. She simply reached up and covered his hand with her own, holding it there against her scarred throat, feeling for the first time in 11 years that the marks she had spent so long trying to conceal were not, in this moment, a source of shame, but simply a part of her history, a part he had chosen to embrace rather than overlook. "I love you," he said, so simply and directly that it took her a moment to understand the words had truly been spoken aloud. "I think I have loved you since the moment I pulled you from that fire, long before I understood what love even was. Finding you again only confirmed what some part of me already knew." "Weston, you need not say it back," he said gently. "I only wanted you to know it plainly, so that whatever happens next, you understand exactly where I stand, and exactly how little I care for anything Cordelia Vane or anyone else might say to shake it." That afternoon marked a turning point Marianne would remember for the rest of her life. She allowed herself, finally, to believe him. She allowed the walls she had spent 11 years constructing to lower, just slightly, just enough to let hope back in. Over the following days, she found herself laughing more easily, speaking more freely, no longer flinching at the sound of whispered conversations behind her back, because for the first time, she had someone standing firmly beside her, who refused to let those whispers define her. Word of the Duke's Ducal Ball, the grandest event of the season, arrived by invitation a week later, and Marianne found herself, for the first time, genuinely looking forward to attending a public gathering rather than dreading it. Weston had made it plain that he intended to make his intentions toward her known before all of society at the ball, a formal announcement that would leave no room for further doubt or whispered speculation. Cordelia Vane received the same invitation with an entirely different set of intentions. "He means to announce it," Cordelia said to Selina, pacing the length of her drawing room with barbed fury coiled tight beneath her composed exterior. "I heard it from my own mother, who heard it from Lady Pemberton, who heard it directly from the Duke's own housekeeper. He intends to declare his affection for that scarred little nobody in front of the entire ton." "What will you do?" Selina asked, watching her friend's furious pacing with a mixture of apprehension and eager anticipation. "I will do what should have been done from the very beginning," Cordelia said, her eyes glittering with cold purpose. "I will remind everyone in that ballroom exactly what Marianne Ellery is, beneath her fine gowns and her careful collars. I will make certain that when the Duke tries to make his grand announcement, the entire room is looking not at his devotion, but at her disfigurement, laid bare for everyone to see and mock as they should have mocked it years ago. How do you mean to manage that?" Cordelia smiled, a slow, cold expression that held nothing of warmth or humor in it. "I have a friend among the household staff hired to serve at the ball. A small accident, carefully arranged, and Miss Ellery's collar will not survive the evening intact. Once her scars are exposed before the entire assembly, no amount of ducal devotion will erase what everyone will have seen with their own eyes. Let him try to declare his love for a woman half of London is laughing at in the very same breath." Selina hesitated, some flicker of conscience stirring beneath her eagerness to please her friend. "Is that not rather cruel, Cordelia? She has done nothing to either of us, beyond existing in a manner you find inconvenient. She has stolen the future I was owed," Cordelia snapped. "I will not apologize for taking back what is mine." She turned to the window, staring out at the darkening street with an expression that promised nothing good for whatever remained of the evening ahead. "The ball is in 4 days. Let us make certain everything is arranged perfectly. I intend for Marianne Ellery to remember this night for the rest of her life, and not for the reason the Duke intends." Unaware of the plot forming against her, Marianne spent those final days before the ball in a state of quiet, careful happiness she had not known she was still capable of feeling. She and Weston walked together nearly every afternoon, spoke of small futures neither of them dared name aloud just yet, and with each passing day, the old armor she had worn since childhood grew thinner, more porous, more willing to let warmth and hope seep through the cracks that 11 years of loneliness had carved into her heart. She did not know, as she selected the gown she would wear to the ducal ball, running her fingers over fabric chosen carefully to complement the high collar that had become such a familiar part of her daily armor, that Cordelia Vane had already set in motion a plan designed to strip that armor away in front of the very people whose good opinion Marianne had spent her whole life fearing to lose. She only knew that for the first time since the fire had taken everything from her, she had something worth fearing to lose again. A future, a love, a place in the world she had once believed forever closed to her. And she walked toward the night of the ball with her heart open, in a way it had not been open in 11 long years, entirely unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the edge of her happiness. The ducal ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles the night of the event, every surface polished to a brilliant shine, every guest of consequence in the district crowded beneath its high painted ceilings. Marianne arrived on her aunt's arm, her gown a deep blue silk that Weston had once mentioned admiring in passing, her collar fastened carefully in place, her heart beating with a nervous, hopeful energy she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Weston found her within minutes of her arrival, his face lighting with open pleasure at the sight of her, and he did not trouble to hide his attention as he led her toward the edge of the dance floor. "You look magnificent," he murmured. "I have been counting the hours until this evening since we last parted." "You flatter me," she said, though she could not entirely suppress her smile. "I do not flatter. I only speak the truth as I see it." He glanced toward the small orchestra tuning their instruments at the far end of the room, then back to her with an expression of quiet determination. "Tonight I intend to make certain everyone in this room understands exactly how I feel about you, Marianne. I hope you are prepared for that." She felt a flutter of nervous excitement at his words, unaware that across the crowded ballroom, Cordelia Vane was watching them with an expression of cold, focused purpose, already tracking the movements of a hired footman who carried a tray of refreshments a little too close to where Marianne stood. The evening proceeded much as any grand ball might, dancing and conversation, and the glittering performance of society at its most elaborate. Marianne danced twice with Weston, once with Colonel Reeve at Weston's gentle insistence, and found herself, for long stretches of the evening, almost forgetting to watch for the cruelty that had shadowed every previous gathering she had attended. For the first time she allowed herself to simply enjoy an evening among people, to laugh freely, to feel, however briefly, as though she truly belonged. It was during a quiet lull between dances, as Marianne stood near the refreshment table speaking with Colonel Reeve's wife, that the footman Cordelia had arranged approached with a tray of lemonade, stumbling with practiced precision directly into Marianne's path. The tray tipped, liquid splashed across her bodice and up toward her collar, and in the chaos of the moment, a second hand, one belonging to Selina Pratt, positioned exactly where Cordelia had instructed, caught at the fabric of Marianne's collar as though attempting to help steady her, and tore it loose at the seam that had been carefully weakened earlier that evening. The collar fell away entirely, exposing the full length of scarring along Marianne's neck, pale and raised and unmistakable beneath the blazing candlelight, visible now to every guest within view of the refreshment table. For one terrible suspended moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Oh," Selina said, her voice pitched perfectly to Carrie, laced with false theatrical distress. "Oh, how dreadful. I am so terribly sorry, Miss Ellery. I did not mean—" But her eyes, when they flicked briefly toward Cordelia standing nearby, betrayed the lie entirely. Marianne stood frozen, one hand rising instinctively to her exposed throat, her whole body trembling with a horror so complete she could not immediately form a single thought. Around her, the whispers began at once, rippling outward through the crowd with terrible speed, gasps and murmurs and, worst of all, the beginning of laughter from somewhere near the edge of the circle now forming around her. Good heavens, look at her neck. I had heard the scarring was severe, but I had no notion. Poor creature. However did she think to hide something so dreadful beneath a simple bit of ribbon? Cordelia stepped forward then, her expression arranged into a mask of pained sympathy that fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the satisfaction gleaming beneath it. "How very unfortunate," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "I do think, dear Miss Ellery, that perhaps such gatherings are simply not suited to someone in your condition. It might be kinder, to yourself and to everyone else, if you were to withdraw quietly rather than continue to draw such uncomfortable attention." The laughter grew louder, crueler, the old familiar sound Marianne had spent 11 years learning to endure, but tonight, standing exposed and humiliated in the middle of the grandest ballroom in the district, with the man she loved certain to hear every word of it, the sound struck her with a force she had never before experienced. She felt the old instinct rising, the desperate urge to flee, to disappear, to make herself as small and invisible as possible, until the humiliation passed. Then a voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk, low and cold and absolutely commanding. "Enough." The single word carried such authority that the entire ballroom fell silent within seconds. Weston Ashcombe crossed the floor with long, furious strides, and the crowd parted before him, as though physically repelled by the force of his anger. He reached Marianne's side and, without a moment's hesitation, removed his own coat and settled it gently around her shoulders, covering what remained exposed with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the barely restrained fury in his expression. "Are you injured?" he asked her quietly, his hands steady despite the visible rage burning beneath his composure. "No," Marianne managed, her voice barely a whisper, "only frightened." "You have nothing more to fear tonight," he said, and then he turned to face the assembled crowd, his gaze sweeping across the room with an intensity that made even the boldest gossips shrink back toward the walls. "I would like every person in this room to understand something clearly," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom without need of raising it further, the natural authority of a man accustomed to command lending weight to every word. 11 years ago, I pulled a 12-year-old child from a burning house with my own hands. I watched a beam collapse across her leg. I carried her through smoke so thick I could barely see my own arms in front of me. The scars you have all just witnessed, the ones some among you found so amusing to mock only moments ago, are proof of a night when this woman survived an inferno that killed both her parents and very nearly killed her as well. The ballroom remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on the Duke, every whispered conversation halted mid-sentence. I have watched over these past weeks as some of you have mocked her, whispered about her, questioned her character and her motives at every turn, simply because she carries visible proof of surviving something most of you cannot begin to imagine. I have watched her endure it with more grace and more dignity than I have seen in any drawing room in this city, and tonight, I watched a deliberate, calculated cruelty inflicted upon her for the entertainment of an audience that ought to know better. His eyes moved to Cordelia Vane, who stood frozen near the refreshment table, her earlier composure entirely shattered under the weight of his gaze. "I know precisely who arranged tonight's accident, Lady Cordelia. I saw your footman's approach, and I saw Miss Pratt's hand at Miss Ellery's collar before it ever came loose. Do not imagine for one moment that your involvement has gone unnoticed." Cordelia's face drained of all color. Beside her, Selina looked as though she might faint from the sheer weight of every eye in the ballroom now turning toward the two of them with dawning, horrified understanding. "I intend to marry Miss Ellery," Weston continued, turning back toward Marianne with an expression that softened instantly from fury to open tenderness. "Not despite what happened to her 11 years ago, but because of the extraordinary courage with which she has carried that history every single day since. I would ask any of you who cannot find it in yourselves to treat her with the respect and admiration she deserves, to remove yourselves from my acquaintance entirely, beginning tonight." He knelt then, in the middle of the ballroom floor, in front of every guest of consequence in the district, and took Marianne's trembling hand in his. "Marianne Ellery," he said, his voice dropping to something more intimate, though it still carried clearly through the silent room. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Marianne stared down at him, tears streaming freely down her face, the coat still wrapped protectively around her shoulders, her scars exposed for all the world to see, and yet, for the first time in 11 years, she found she did not care who saw them. Not with him kneeling before her, not with his eyes holding hers with such open, fearless devotion, not with the truth of everything he had just declared still ringing through the silent ballroom. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, I will." The ballroom erupted, not in the cruel laughter of moments before, but in a wave of astonished, spontaneous applause that seemed to rise from every corner of the room at once. Colonel Reeve was among the first to step forward, clapping Weston firmly on the shoulder with open delight, and within moments, guest after guest pressed forward to offer their congratulations, many of them the very same people who had whispered cruelly about Marianne only minutes before, now falling over themselves to be seen supporting the match. Cordelia Vane did not wait to witness the full extent of her humiliation. She fled the ballroom with Selina trailing behind her, the two of them disappearing into the night, as the whispers that had once been aimed at Marianne turned instead toward them, carrying a story that would follow both young women through every drawing room in the district for seasons to come. Weston rose to his feet and drew Marianne gently into his arms, careless of who might be watching, and pressed a kiss to her temple with a tenderness that spoke louder than any declaration he had made before the assembled crowd. "You never have to hide again," he murmured against her hair. "Not from anyone, not ever again, for as long as I live." Marianne closed her eyes and let herself simply feel it, the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his arms around her, the astonishing, unfamiliar sensation of being celebrated rather than mocked, seen rather than hidden, loved rather than merely tolerated. 11 years of loneliness seemed to dissolve in that single moment, replaced by a future she had never allowed herself to imagine might actually be hers to claim. News of the ducal ball spread through the district with the speed of a grass fire, and by the following morning, there was scarcely a household of consequence that had not heard some version of the story: the Duke's furious defense, his public proposal, and the shameful, calculated cruelty of Lady Cordelia Vane and Miss Selina Pratt. What had once been Cordelia's greatest weapon, the power of gossip and social opinion, turned against her with devastating speed and thoroughness. Invitations that had once arrived at Cordelia's door in great numbers slowed to a trickle within days. Mothers who had once courted her friendship for their own daughter's benefit now steered their families carefully away from any association with her name. The very drawing rooms where she had once held court, dispensing cruel commentary about Marianne Ellery to an eager audience, now closed their doors to her entirely, the story of her calculated humiliation of a scarred orphan proving far more damaging to her own reputation than anything she had ever managed to inflict on Marianne's. "I do not understand how this happened," Cordelia said bitterly to her mother, several days after the ball, as yet another invitation was quietly withdrawn. "I only meant to expose the truth of what she is." "You meant to humiliate a defenseless girl in front of the entire district, and you were caught doing it by a duke," her mother said, with little sympathy to spare. "You have made yourself a villain in a story people will delight in retelling for years, Cordelia. There is no swift recovery from such a thing." Selina Pratt fared little better, her own family quietly encouraging her to spend the remainder of the season visiting relations in the countryside, well away from the pointed whispers and cold shoulders that now greeted her at every gathering she dared attend. Neither young woman would find their circumstances easily repaired, and though Marianne felt no particular satisfaction in their downfall, she found she could not summon much sympathy for it either, not after so many years of enduring their cruelty in silence. Mrs. Ophelia Ellery, for her part, seemed genuinely shaken by the events of the ball, and in the days that followed, Marianne noticed a change in her aunt's manner that she had not expected. The older woman appeared one afternoon in the small back parlor, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, and spoke with a hesitance Marianne had rarely heard from her. "I have not been the guardian you deserved," Mrs. Ellery said quietly, unable to meet her niece's eyes. "I took you in because it was expected of me, and I fear I never once asked myself whether duty alone was enough for a child who had lost everything. I watched you endure cruelty in rooms I shared with you, and I said nothing, because saying something might have drawn unwanted attention to our own family. I am ashamed of that now, more than I know how to express." Marianne studied her aunt's face, searching for the calculation she had grown so accustomed to seeing there, and found instead something that looked genuinely like remorse. "You gave me a home when you had no obligation beyond the barest legal duty," Marianne said slowly. "I will not pretend it was enough, but I understand now that grief and fear can make people smaller than they wish to be. I do not hold it against you, Aunt. I only hope that going forward, you might find it in yourself to be kinder, not only to me, but to anyone else who crosses your path carrying burdens you cannot see." Her aunt's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and for the first time in 11 years, she reached across the space between them and took Marianne's hand in her own, a small gesture that meant more than any grand apology could have offered. The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations, each day bringing some new proof of how thoroughly society's opinion of Marianne had shifted since the night of the ball. Invitations poured in from families who had once looked past her without a second glance, all of them eager now to claim some connection, however small, to the woman who would soon become Duchess of Thornbury. Marianne accepted this newfound warmth with a wry, private amusement, understanding perfectly well how quickly the same people would have turned against her again had circumstances been different, but she allowed herself, for Weston's sake and her own, to enjoy the ease of it rather than dwell too long on its shallow foundations. Weston, for his part, remained utterly unmoved by the sudden shift in public opinion, treating every guest with the same measured courtesy regardless of how they had once spoken of his bride, though those who had been particularly cruel found themselves quietly, permanently excluded from any gathering hosted at Thornbury House. "You need not forgive them," he told Marianne one evening, as they sat together in the garden where their courtship had first taken root, "simply because they have suddenly discovered good manners now that it suits them. You owe no one the comfort of easy forgiveness, least of all those who spent years finding sport in your pain." "I do not forgive them for their sake," Marianne said thoughtfully, watching the last light fade from the evening sky. "I think perhaps I forgive them, where I can, for my own. I do not wish to carry their cruelty with me into whatever life we build together. I would rather fill that space with something better." He took her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, his eyes full of quiet admiration. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said. "I count myself the most fortunate man in England, that I happened to be riding past a burning house on the one night that mattered more than any other in my life." The wedding itself took place on a bright morning in early autumn, in a small stone church that Weston had chosen specifically for its quiet intimacy rather than the grandeur his rank might have demanded. Marianne walked down the aisle in a gown of pale gold silk, her collar absent for the first time at any public gathering she had ever attended, her scars visible and unhidden beneath the soft morning light streaming through the windows. She had chosen, deliberately and with Weston's full support, to be married exactly as she was, without concealment, without apology, a final and complete rejection of the 11 years she had spent believing herself something to be hidden away. Colonel Reeves stood as Weston's groomsman, beaming with open pride throughout the ceremony, and Mrs. Ellery wept openly in the front pew, her earlier coldness entirely replaced by genuine, overflowing joy for the niece she had finally come to know and appreciate. When Weston lifted Marianne's hand and slid the ring onto her finger, declaring before God and the small gathering of witnesses that he would love and honor her for the whole of his life, Marianne felt, for the first time since she was 12 years old, that the fire which had once taken everything from her had, in some strange and unexpected way, finally led her home. They emerged from the church into brilliant autumn sunlight, husband and wife, and the small crowd gathered outside broke into warm applause. No trace of the cruel laughter that had once followed Marianne through every public gathering of her life. She looked up at Weston, radiant with a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach, and understood at last that the girl who had once been pulled from a burning house had finally, truly, been saved. 5 years passed, and the Duchess of Thornbury had become, in that time, one of the most quietly admired figures in the district, known not for the scars she had once tried so desperately to hide, but for a warmth and generosity that seemed to draw people toward her from every corner of society. She never wore a collar to conceal her neck again, not once in 5 years, and though whispers had followed her occasionally in the early months of her marriage, they had long since faded into something closer to respect, and in many circles, genuine affection. Weston had proven, in every year of their marriage, as steady and devoted as he had promised on the night of the ball, and their household had grown to include 2 young children, a boy with his father's dark, serious eyes and a girl with her mother's quiet strength, both of them raised to understand that kindness mattered more than appearance, and that courage often looked less like grand gestures and more like simply enduring, day after day, with dignity and tact. On a bright spring afternoon, Marianne attended a garden party hosted by a family newly arrived in the district, eager to establish themselves among the local gentry. She moved easily through the crowd now, greeted warmly by faces that had once turned away from her in disgust, and found herself, as she often did at such gatherings, drawn instinctively toward the edges of the party, where the quieter guests tended to gather. It was there that she noticed a young woman standing alone near a hedge of blooming roses, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, her sleeve pulled carefully down over one hand in a manner Marianne recognized instantly, the same careful, practiced concealment she herself had once perfected over 11 long years. Nearby, a cluster of young ladies whispered behind their fans, their eyes flicking toward the girl with the particular cruelty of the young and thoughtless. Marianne caught fragments of their conversation as she approached, comments about a childhood accident, about a hand that would never look quite right, about how unfortunate it was that such a pretty face should be paired with something so unsightly. The young woman's cheeks had gone pink with the effort of pretending not to hear, and Marianne recognized in her posture, the careful stillness, the eyes fixed on some distant point across the garden, the same defense she herself had built brick by brick after the fire that took her parents. She crossed the lawn and came to stand beside the girl, offering a warm, easy smile. "The roses are especially lovely this year, are they not? I always find this particular corner of the garden the most peaceful spot at any gathering." The young woman startled, clearly unaccustomed to anyone seeking out her company at the edges of a party. "Yes, Your Grace, they are lovely." "You need not call me Your Grace so formally," Marianne said gently. "I remember quite well what it felt like to stand at the edge of a garden, hoping no one would look too closely." She glanced meaningfully at the girl's carefully concealed hand, then met her eyes with quiet understanding rather than pity. "I was not always a duchess. I spent a great many years as the girl everyone whispered about, the one with scars no fine gown could ever quite hide." The young woman's eyes widened with surprise. "I had heard something of your history, Your Grace, but I confess I did not think that someone who had lived it might still remember what it felt like," Marianne finished with a small, knowing smile. I remember it every day. I do not think a person ever entirely forgets the particular loneliness of being seen as something to be pitied rather than someone to be known. But I have learned, in the years since, that such loneliness does not have to last forever, and that the people whose opinions cause it are very rarely worth the pain they inflict. How did you bear it? The young woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper, glancing nervously toward the cluster of young ladies still whispering nearby. The whispering, I mean. The way people look at you. Marianne considered the question carefully, remembering 11 years of ballrooms and drawing rooms, of collars fastened tight against her throat, of a loneliness so complete, it had nearly convinced her she was unworthy of any happiness at all. I bore it because I had no choice. For a very long time, she said honestly. But I will tell you something I wish someone had told me, all those years ago. The scars people mock are very rarely the ones that matter. What matters is what you carry inside yourself. The courage it takes simply to keep walking into rooms full of people who have not yet learned to see you properly. That courage is worth far more than their approval ever could be. She reached out and gently squeezed the young woman's concealed hand, an act of simple, deliberate kindness that made the girl's eyes fill with sudden tears. You do not owe anyone an explanation for how you came to carry whatever marks you carry. You do not owe them concealment either, though I understand well enough why you might choose it for now. But I promise you, there will come a day, and perhaps it will come sooner than you think, when someone will look at you and see exactly what I see standing here today. A young woman of remarkable quiet strength, entirely worthy of being known and loved exactly as she is. The young woman wiped at her eyes, offering a small, tremulous smile. Thank you, Your Grace. I do not think anyone has ever spoken to me so plainly about it before. Then I am glad I found this corner of the garden today, Marianne said warmly. Come, walk with me a while. I find I have grown rather fond of proving to young ladies at the edges of parties that they need not remain there if they do not wish to. Across the lawn, Weston watched his wife lead the young stranger back toward the heart of the gathering, drawing her gently into conversation with a small circle of genuinely kind acquaintances, and he felt the same swell of quiet pride and love that had never once dimmed in the 5 years since he had knelt before her in a crowded ballroom and asked her to become his wife. He thought, watching her now, of the girl he had carried from a burning house so many years ago, and of the extraordinary woman she had become, one who had taken every ounce of cruelty the world had shown her and transformed it, patiently and deliberately, into a well of kindness for anyone else who might find themselves standing alone at the edge of a garden, waiting to be seen. That evening, as the last guest departed and the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, Marianne sat with Weston on the terrace of their home, their 2 children asleep upstairs, the quiet peace of the estate settling comfortably around them. She told him about the young woman in the garden, about the careful concealment she had recognized so easily, about the small hope she hoped she had managed to plant in a heart that badly needed it. You have a gift for that, Weston said, watching her with open admiration, finding the ones who need to be seen, and simply seeing them. I had a great deal of practice being the one who needed it, Marianne said softly. I think perhaps that is the only real gift my scars ever gave me, the ability to recognize that same loneliness in others, and the chance to offer them something I once desperately wished someone had offered me. Weston reached over and took her hand, the same gentle grip that had once steadied her through her very first dance in 11 years, and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. Whatever gift the fire left you with, he said quietly, I have never in my life been more grateful for anything than I am for the night I found you again. Marianne leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last light fade over the hills, and thought of the frightened girl who had once believed herself unworthy of love, of laughter, of a single ordinary happiness. That girl had walked through 11 long years of quiet endurance, certain the fire had taken everything worth having from her life. She had never once imagined that the very thing she had spent so long trying to hide would one day become the bridge that led her, finally and completely, home. The scars remained, pale and permanent along her neck and hand, a lasting record of the night that had changed the entire course of her life. But she no longer saw them as marks of shame to be concealed behind careful collars and averted eyes. She saw them now for what they truly were, proof that she had survived something terrible, and had gone on, against every expectation the world had placed upon her, to build a life rich with love, purpose, and a quiet, unshakable sense of her own worth. And in gardens across the district, whenever a lonely young woman found herself standing at the edge of a gathering, hiding some private mark the world had taught her to be ashamed of, she might find, if she was fortunate, a duchess crossing the lawn to stand beside her, offering nothing more than a warm smile and the simple, transformative gift of being truly seen.